Hi, welcome to the DRH show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with interesting people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a clinical psychologist, Dr. Aimee Daramus. Thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
It's great to have you here, Dr. Daramus. So let's start off with you telling us your backstory, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
hmm So I've always been in psych. Like a lot of people, I just found the college intro to psych course really fascinating. Took a few more. Um, I did an undergraduate internship. Some of my friends were coming back from internships saying it was basically just a position as an unpaid administrative assistant. And so I asked my teacher, can you get me anything with actual clients so that I can find out if I like this before I go to grad school for it? He's like, okay, that's a little unusual, but we'll see what we can do. And a few days later, he called me into his office, handed me a Diet Coke. It was a thing at my college. Um, every teacher had a mini fridge full of Diet Coke, and if they offered you one, you were fine. And if they didn't offer you one, you knew you were in the doghouse about something. But he offered me one, so that's good. And then he waited until I had lifted the Diet Coke to my lips and said, I've got something with violent criminal offenders. You want? And of course, I choked and spat the Diet Coke all over his desk. And that was my intro to my professional role in psych. I ended up taking the job and actually getting a lot out of it, learned a ton, learned that I actually really liked the field. And so I went to grad school, and I have always worked with people with major mental illness. I've worked on a psychiatric unit in community mental health, and now I'm in private practice, and I teach at a local community college. So it's kind of how I got in the field.
Yeah, brilliant. And of course, aside from being a clinical practitioner, I also understand that you're an author. You wrote a book called Understanding Bipolar Disorder. So
Yeah.
can you please tell us more about the book? Is it for also practitioners like yourself, or is
Yeah.
it just more for people who have experience of bipolar disorder?
Um, it's mostly for the families of people with bipolar disorder. I've had a lot of experiences where clients do not get a lot of family support. Sometimes that's because the families are neglectful or abusive, but a lot of times they just don't know what to do with this situation. So a big part of that book is helping families learn a little bit about bipolar, what it is, why their family member is doing these strange things that don't make a lot of sense, or have these moods that don't make a lot of sense. Um, Communication skills, coping skills, how to handle different psych emergencies, just basically the information you'd need to understand what's going on with your family member with bipolar disorder and handle some of the problems that you might come across.
And I would imagine that you would have discussed this in your book in
Mhm.
further detail. But if you
Yeah.
could just give us like a snapshot of some of the misconceptions about bipolar disorder. I would imagine a lot
Yeah.
of people still don't know what bipolar disorder is. So if you could
Yeah.
just give us a bit of a snapshot.
Yeah, absolutely. So bipolar disorder is a psychiatric disorder. It's mostly biological. It can be affected by stress. It can be affected by relationships, but usually there's a very strong genetic component to it. It's at least partially inherited. And you have different mood episodes that are very extreme. Some are depression, and it looks a lot like major depression, but it usually doesn't respond as easily to therapy. And there are also manic episodes, which are periods of very, very high energy, like not sleeping for days at a time. Um, Impulsivity, you will do a lot of things that you wouldn't normally do. It might involve like huge multi-credit card spending sprees. It might involve getting involved in relationships or sexual situations that you wouldn't normally. For some people, there's a lot of anger and getting into fights, so that's a more rare presentation. Um, there are also hypomanic episodes, which are kind of a lighter version of a manic episode. You're still basically functioning. And hypomanic episodes, for some people, are actually very productive and a lot of fun, but it's still out of control. Um, so in a hypomanic episode, your behavior is still a little bit impulsive, no dancing on a table at company functions kind of thing, no going jogging in the middle of the city at 2 a.m. Um, and there's still that episode that no matter how that place that no matter how productive it is, no matter how fun it is sometimes for some people, you still can't stop. You know, it's dancing through life, but you don't have the ability to stop dancing and sit down.
And just moving on to like general mental health. General mental health. Of course, you're a clinical psychologist. You've been exposed to a number of mental health issues. Now, as a practitioner, would you say, Dr. Daramus, that there's an ongoing mental health crisis even before the pandemic?
Oh, yes. I mean, one of the very, very few good things to come out of the pandemic is that it's become a lot more acceptable to talk about mental health, to just say, you know, I'm really wrecked today. I feel depressed. I feel anxious. And things are starting to open up because we're all having that shared experience. And I think for a long time, well, forever, pretty much, it has been very forbidden to talk about your mental health. Which means it comes out in other ways. It can come out as anger. It can come out as, you know, different bad habits. But a lot of people for a long time have been suffering even just with your basic depression and anxiety without being able to say so, for fear of what people will think at their job, for fear of, you know, starting a problem in the family that they don't want to start, or for fear of it limiting who they can have relationships with. Now, in a very, very big way, mental health is worse because of the pandemic, because people have been so isolated, because things like COVID precautions and politics have caused so many conflicts that can be driving families apart. At the same time, there is that tiny little light at the end of the tunnel that a lot of people are realizing that we need to talk about these things more.
Yeah, that's also another thing that we have to realize, that actually more people are actually saying that they've got mental health issues is because we, as a society in general, have made significant progress, that when we acknowledge it as that it is as important as physical health. Now, one thing that I like about you, Dr. Daramus, is because I've done research before in preparation for this interview, and I understand that it's also part of your advocacy to make complex psychological science relevant and easy to understand. And not a lot of practitioners actually do that, because it seems sometimes they just stuck in their own bubble. But you're an academic, you're a practitioner, and you also, you know, have a sort of an advocacy linking science with the general public. So if you could just share to the audience, how do you try to achieve this?
A lot of it is just putting it in the right words. So a lot of the really popular science books are very, very good, but they're still basically written for at least a college-educated audience. So books that use just regular everyday language like you would use when talking to your friends as much as possible, that is very valuable. Articles that put things in those kinds of terms, like this is something you could work into a conversation fairly comfortably. It's not formal academic. If I use technical terms, I try my best to break them down. This is what this word means. So instead of being, you know, confused by this word and like, I can't even read this thing. Okay, now I understand what people are saying when they use that word. And that's really important because a lot of mental conditions have a strong biological piece to them, even the ones that aren't genetic, that understanding why this is happening, what's going on in the brain, can be really useful. And there is a lot of good psychological research out there that goes unused because there's nobody to translate it into a form where it's usable to the average person.
Absolutely.
And then, like when I'm teaching, I'm also trying to teach basic skills. This is how you read a research paper. This is what this section means. This is what this section means. Stuff like that to try and translate in the other direction as well.
Absolutely. And when you said that, you know, we have to communicate it in a way that the public would understand, actually, that's one of, shall we say, strategy of PsycReg. And you, I'm also very grateful that you write relevant articles to PsycReg, especially coming from a practitioner. But we encourage people who write for us to write the way they talk. So you don't really have to couch it in such, you know, like very technical language, because our audience is the general public, what you've said. Another thing that I'm interested to hear from you, Dr. Daramus, is what about social media? Because it's not just, you know, articles and public engagement like what we're doing right now, because this is a form of public engagement, you know, we're talking about psychological aspects on YouTube. But what about social media such as Twitter and LinkedIn? Do you also harness those platforms to communicate to the general public?
Oh, absolutely. Probably my biggest professional profile is Twitter, which of course is limited because you've only got so many characters. But, you know, I found a huge community of people, not just practitioners, people with mental health problems, people who've had certain mental health problems and they're practitioners. So they understand things on a whole different level. So it's great for building community with people. My Instagram, not so much. I've basically turned it into a psychology bookstagram, which is fun. I think it's really trendy right now to kind of trash social media, especially if you're on social media, you know, get on Twitter and say terrible things about Twitter or whatever. And there's the trend for the social media fast, and it's completely okay to step away from social media. But then you've got people who are basically getting on social media to tell their entire friend group, all of social media is toxic and I need a break. Well, honestly, there's a place in life for telling your entire friend group they're toxic and you need to get away from them. I think people are overdoing it. But so what I kind of encourage people to do with that is, you know, if you need to take a break from social media, do it. That's reasonable. Like you could need to take a break from anything in life. Like we need vacations from work. But ultimately, it's better to ask yourself how you're using social media. What are you accessing on social media that's toxic for you? How can you set boundaries? Do you need to use like the block or delete or unfollow a little more often? And then find those sections of social media that are actually going to be supportive and a community for you.
And talking about community, you mentioned earlier that you teach at a university, you teach community mental health. Now, for those of us who are not familiar about that particular aspect of mental health, can you please tell us what is meant by community mental health and why is it important?
Community mental health recognizes that a mental health problem isn't always individual or not only individual, that we can be affected by things that are going on around us at a community or national or world level. Up until recently, again, that's been a really unfamiliar idea, but now people are seeing, okay, there's this big illness. We've all had to change our lives in so many ways for it, and it is affecting our mental health. So COVID is actually a really good example of the way that any problem in a community can play a part in depression, in anxiety, in even other more biological mental illnesses by, you know, putting stressors into place that can make those worse. So community mental health is recognizing that sometimes mental health treatment means kind of healing an entire community, finding what's wrong in a community that is causing people in that community to have higher mental health problems than maybe another community, what needs fixed at that level.
Absolutely. And so most of your students, I would imagine they're from different backgrounds. And so I would imagine you would have really a fruitful discussion when you're talking about community mental health.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that I want to hear from you, Dr. Daramus, is that I understand that you're also doing some consulting for filmmakers and writers on how to address or reduce stigma in their portrayal in the media of mental illness. So from your own experience and from the research that you've done, what do you think are the common lapses that filmmakers tend to commit when they try to portray mental illness within media?
Well, the biggest one, of course, is still, you know, kind of only bringing mental illness into the picture when the person is like a victim of a crime or the perpetrator. You know, presenting people with serious mental illness as that person who's kind of like hiding behind a bush in the park waiting to attack innocent middle-class citizens. And so, of course, that's a very damaging stigma. Also presenting them like as the victim. And a lot of people are trying really hard to be sensitive to that and not do it. Sometimes that results in something that's definitely an improvement, but could still use some work, which is cleaning it up too much. You know, what some people call disability porn, where it's purely inspirational and you don't really get into any of the kind of like ugly, gritty, hard side of dealing with a mental illness. So reducing stigma means kind of presenting mental illness in a way that's both, you know, sensitive to their feelings, sensitive to stigma, and real. You don't ignore the hard parts, you just deal with them in a certain way that's supportive.
I don't know, Dr. Daramus, if you've seen the film, the 1960 film Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. That would, I think, that be your, stereotypical example of, I think, lapses in trying to portray mental illness in media. But would you be able to share to us some of the films that have really good depiction, a positive depiction of mental health, which is accurate and which is not really fantasized? I'm sorry for putting you on the spot.
Not at all. It's a good question. So it's more of an indie film and newer, but it's going to be on some streaming services. There's one called Letters to Daniel. It is by a woman named Amy McCorkle who has bipolar and has a pretty significant trauma history. And she wrote a somewhat fictionalized version of her story. The Letters to Daniel reference is interesting because she coped, and I'm not giving away anybody's private information. All this is in the book, it's in the movie, by writing letters to the actor Daniel Craig, but not actually sending them. It was more a form of journaling. And that was her way of kind of writing to somebody who she imagined would be kind of strong and supportive for her until she could kind of build that community for herself. And now that film has been made and has actually won a fair few awards and been at quite a lot of film festivals. So it's doing very well. Sorry. And it does a great job of being very, very real about both the hard parts of mental illness and about hope for recovery, about having a really supportive community around you and how on earth you would do that.
I'm talking about psychological films. I actually run...
So that's a good example, more on the indie end.
Sorry?
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, what's the name of the film again? Sorry.
Letters to Daniel.
Letters to Daniel. Actually, Dr. Daramus, talking about psychological films, I run a list of psychological films in PsychReg, and I don't have that particular film on PsychReg, so I'll include that, and then I'll put that on the description notes, so for anyone who's interested to watch that, they can watch that. Now, let's move on to another aspect of your clinical work. I understand that you also kind of advocate video games and therapy. Now, I'm not a gamer myself, but actually my husband is a video gamer. So if you could just tell us, how can we actually harness the use of video games to promote positive mental health and also in clinical therapy in general?
There's a lot, and there's a surprising amount of actual, good quality research on this topic. Although a lot of people have found it out intuitively too. So just even very simple video games that you can put on your phone, like your basic Tetris and Solitaire. They're really good, for example, for people with very, very high anxiety. So like if your anxiety is that kind that goes from like 0 to 10 in no time at all, and you don't really have time to kind of put in some coping skills that you might have learned like from your therapist or from a program or a book or something, video games are designed to grab your attention. That's what they're supposed to do. That's why we promise ourselves, okay, I'm going to play for half an hour, and 4 hours later, we're still doing it. But for helping as an initial step, not by any means a complete treatment, but just an initial step in calming a severe anxiety attack, that can be really useful because the video games sometimes have the power to seize attention away from the anxiety and bring the anxiety down at least a little, to the point where maybe some of the other coping skills that will be able to take effect. You'll be able to actually use kind of, meditation or distraction or, sensory techniques to further calm yourself. So that's a good use of video games. With the video game Tetris, there's a lot of research now. Well, not a lot, but a few studies, but they're all pointing in the same direction, that Tetris can actually have a very, very real and long-term impact on intrusive thoughts in PTSD. So again, by no means is it a complete treatment, but people who play Tetris as kind of a distraction to re-engage kind of the thinking parts of their brain and move away from the fear-based parts of the brain. There've been 1 or 2 studies that said it can actually help reduce rates of PTSD a little bit, and more specifically, reduce those intrusive thoughts and memories. And then companies that design video games are actually starting to produce video games that are designed to treat mental illness, to build coping skills. For depression, there's Night in the Woods. There is Grease, which is more about grief management. There's Sea of Solitude, which has a lot to do with kind of loneliness and low self-image. For anxiety, there are different forms of biofeedback, which is basically where you meditate and you're hooked up to your computer and it can show you how kind of your vital signs are improving so that you can see yourself getting good results. And then some of those also integrate video games, where you can only win a video game by lowering your own anxiety. So imagine, for example, a hot air balloon race, where the calmer you are, the more you're able to calm yourself with your coping skills, the faster the hot air balloon race goes. And you can only win the game by getting to a certain level of anxiety management. There's even one called Hellblade. Doesn't sound very mental healthy, but it's actually designed to help people with psychosis learn to tell the difference between what's real and what's a hallucination, how to counter some of the thoughts and voices you might be experiencing. So that connection between mental health and gaming is getting stronger and stronger.
There's actually, Dr. Daramus, there's actually an overlap.
And of course, that's not even getting into virtual reality, which is a whole other set of different kinds of games. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, Dr. Daramus, there's actually an overlap between our research interests, because I'm doing my PhD in clinical psychology, and my research project focuses on focuses also on digital mental health intervention, whereas you're advocating for the use of video games and advocating for blogging to resilience. But one of the common questions when I tell people what my research project is that how do you actually strike the balance between, trying to reduce the screen time and at the same time trying to promote a positive mental health? Because it's really kind of sounds counterintuitive that, we're already spending much of our, well, at least in my case and for the people that I know, we're spending much of our waking hours in front of the internet. And then you're also using internet and video games to promote positive mental health. So as a practitioner, how would you address such aspect of digital mental health intervention?
Personally, I wouldn't look at screen time alone as a very good measure. It's more like, what are you doing with that screen time? Who are you with online? What kind of different kinds of content are you accessing? Maybe developing the skill of noticing, okay, what's changing in the way I feel? What's changing in my body even? How is my body reacting to this content? And recognizing, okay, it's this type of content that I come out of feeling more anxious or more depressed, or I've got more muscle tension in my body that might mean something's wrong. So I would be focusing less on screen time and more on what you're doing with that screen time, but also recognizing that as far as disability access, for some people who can't get out of the house easily, the internet is usually the only social life they get on a regular basis. If you live alone especially, or other people in your house are out of the house at work a lot, or even just people who live in very, very remote areas where they don't have a lot of chance to socialize, that being able to socialize on the internet isn't just about COVID, and just isn't just about, teenagers. It's a great way of integrating people, into a community that don't otherwise really have that option very easily. So, what are the purposes for which this person is using screen time? Why screen time as opposed to in-person time? Those are some very complex and individual questions. I mean, for me, I can't wait to get out a bit more. I'm looking forward to it. So Chicago, if you could just please behave yourself so we don't have another spike, that
Yeah,
would be lovely.
absolutely. We're
But
all waiting for.
no doubt, screen time's been a lifesaver the last year.
Now, Dr. Daramus, just like we've mentioned earlier, you actually have your own psychological practice. Now, a lot of people who would be watching this interview, they're also interested in setting up their own psychological practice. So can you give us some tips?
So I don't own it. I work for a very large private practice in Chicago. The last private practice I was with, I didn't own it, but I was part of administration. I don't know. I kind of like working for another practice. I liked that couple of years where I was at a practice where I could actually learn how to run the business, but honestly, I'm having a lot more fun not having to run the business. And it can be a much easier way to run the private practice because, you know, the sometimes as much as a day or two of administrative and business stuff you have to do every week, you know, cuts into your ability to make enough money. So I would say, because you're not making, you know, you're not making any money when you're just doing your taxes, doing the other business things. So you have to be able to balance actually being able to see clients with all the work that's going to take. So I think my biggest advice to anybody who wants their own private practice, go in with a solid business plan. Don't even go there until you've learned some basic business skills, put together a business plan that'll work. I know in the US, we've got small business administrations that can be really helpful with that sort of thing. Just buying some books and trying to understand them, taking some business courses, because there are a lot of really, really good, really worthwhile therapists who lose their practices every day, no matter how good they are clinically. So I think really the biggest place where people fall down is, you know, not fully understanding what it takes to run a private practice and building those skills.
And it's not just skills, actually. It's also, I think, like your interest and your personality. Like I have a background in clinical psychology. I'm doing a PhD in clinical psychology, but I could not really imagine myself running a practice. I see myself more as a researcher and someone managing a psychology website. I think that's also something that you have to take into account, whether, you know, it really jives in with your personality. Now, as a practitioner and as a researcher, Dr. Daramus, are there any emerging trends in psychology or mental health that you're excited about?
Oh yeah, lots. Personally, I know I'm going to get a lot of disagreement with this, but I am really, really excited about a lot of the advances in brain science that are showing us the exact mechanisms behind mental illnesses. And that's actually really helpful to me in therapy, because if I understand the mechanism behind a certain symptom, it is so much easier to pick the right treatment, because it takes some of the guesswork out of it. Plus, I just think the science is cool. There's definitely a fun factor there. And aside from video games, there is a huge body of research on other aspects of pop culture. How to use fan fiction in therapy, how to use cosplay in therapy, how to, you know, there's VR, you know, virtual reality. There is a lot of different ways to use even just like your favorite TV shows, your favorite movies, your favorite books in therapy in different ways. So I do like the brain science end of it, but I also like this emerging creative end of it. And because it's based on pop culture that the clients will have seen, will know, it is also just by its nature making them a bigger part of the decision making in the therapy process.
And I understand that there's a common theme with the kind of work that you do. You're trying to make psychology more accessible and more relevant. And you mentioned about popular media. And I suppose I just want to play the devil's advocate here. A lot of, especially like researcher and academics and psychologists, they would say that that's the problem with these aspects of science communication. You're trying to make psychology too popular, that in a way you're already verging towards pop psychology, and in effect it actually diminishes the science aspect of psychology. So what would you say about that?
I think it's a realistic concern. You know, trying to draw that line between this is what's going on in the brain this is what we're actually doing in a session, and this is, how that fits into a treatment plan. This is how that connects to what you can do at home to cope with a mental health problem. I'm trying to make that a very, very big part of writing, of what I write, of what I say, when I'm speaking in public, things like that. Because a researcher like you, on the one hand, you need, for your research to really matter, you need therapists to be able to use it with clients. That's your impact. And I can't do my job as well as I would like to without researchers like you. So I absolutely need you to be doing what you're doing. And the complex part, like you said, is drawing that line between the research and what's actually happening in therapy. On the other hand, there, other areas of science have done it. There are, you've got, Michio Kaku in physics. You've got Neil deGrasse Tyson in astrophysics. You've got all these really great science writers who have been able to help popularize science without diluting it. And that's kind of what I'm going for when I'm talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think we also have to give credit to really famous psychologists who are really also research and also popularizing their research. One of my favorite is Angela Duckworth. She's also a TED speaker. And I have to mention her because my research area is about resilience, and it kind of overlaps with what she's also researching, which is great. So like what you've said, there's really need to be a balance between trying to popularize psychology and trying to keep it as evidence-based and empirical as possible. Now, Dr. Daramus, you mentioned earlier that you wrote a book about bipolar disorder. So I'm just interested to find out, have you got any future writing topics in mind?
I do. Like for Psych Reg, I'm thinking. In fact, I've already started working on an article that's basically about some of the things I've learned about bipolar from people with bipolar. So what do the clients have to teach us that we would not have learned in school, basically, about the day-to-day experience of such a disorder? And then I'm actually talking with a publisher. I don't want to say too much because it's in a very, very early stage, but potentially writing something about that kind of pop culture and tech and psychology. And if I did, I'd want it to be very much along the lines of what we just talked about. Here's what the research says. Here's what that means for therapy. Here's how this would play out in real life and how it would actually help somebody. Here's where you would fit it into the treatment plan. And connecting it to established theories, like where is this particular thing we're getting from pop culture consistent with CBT or DBT or interpersonal or some established theory like that. And those are some areas I'd really like to write about. And then, of course, I'd love to do more books that are on that subject of what can family members and friends do to be more supportive of people with a mental illness without getting burnt out themselves?
Absolutely. Those are brilliant topics. If you already have a published book around those areas, do let us know, and we'll happy to, spread the word through Psych Reg. And I just want to hear, of course, Dr. Daramus, I just want to hear who inspires you both professionally and personally?
This is going to sound absolutely ridiculous, but honestly, pop culture wise, one of my biggest role models was always Sherlock Holmes, from the time I was 10. And I didn't even realize it until recently, but there's so many things you hear him saying that are echoed in the way I do things. I mean, I'm obviously, a lot more relational. I'm a therapist, and it is so much about the relationship, but that belief in evidence. In the books, you find him way ahead of his time as far as wanting to integrate science into his area. He was somebody very powerful, very brilliant, who still, you see him treating very ordinary people with respect. And that kind of ties to my belief in empowering the average person to be able to participate in their mental health instead of seeing it as, I'm going to go get the expert to fix me. Even there was a point in his career in the books where he said, I can take any client I want without worrying about the money. So it did not matter to him about your social rank or your money. If your problem interested him and he felt like he could do something about it, he would take the case. And that's something I'm working towards. And it's one of the benefits I hope for from the writing is to be able to be making enough income from that. Eventually, I can take the same attitude. I don't have to care one bit about how much money you have. If I think I can help you, then I will. At least until we can figure out what we're going to do about the healthcare system to make therapy more accessible. I've kind of got my own plan. So, on that pop culture theme, that would be a big influence on me. There is a doctor named Nadine Burke-Harris who works a lot on, well, right now I think she's the Surgeon General of California, which is thrilling to have somebody so interested in mental health. She works a lot on how trauma affects people, especially at the community level that you were talking about earlier. So she's been a big role model. A lot of the good science writers, like I said, probably one of the biggest was a contemporary of Freud. In fact, at one point, one of his students, Alfred Adler, that's the reason I ended up coming to Chicago to go to Adler University, is because back in like the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, Adler was already saying, there are social issues of prejudice, of discrimination, of poverty that are affecting people's mental health. He was the first person to develop really family interventions for therapy. Some of his work with memory was way ahead of his time and wouldn't actually be confirmed in the research until Elizabeth Loftus in like the 1980s. And she's a huge role model because when she saw that some of her research was contradicting what therapists were actually doing, and that there were potentially ways that therapists were making things worse in the way that they worked with memory at that time, she almost lost her entire career. She was dangerously close to losing her academic career for speaking out against kind of established doctrine. Now, of course, she's a hero, as she should be, but she kind of spoke her truth, pointed to the research that backed that up, and she was actually personally involved in a lot of legal cases where people had been wrongly convicted based on witness memory. And she got a lot of people out of jail that should never have been there in the first place and prevented people from going to jail when they shouldn't be, by showing the inaccuracy of memory. And that's also controversial right now, because there have certainly been times when she talked about that on cases where maybe she wasn't exactly on the side of the angels. And so that's a problem to be thought of. But just the fact that she's willing to stand up for that and has been trying to use that to help people, even at a serious threat to her career, has been very inspiring for me.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing to us some of those people who actually inspire you. And I just have to say something about Sherlock. I'm actually a Columbo fan. I don't know if you know Columbo and the
yes, the old detective show.
Yeah, I'm more of a Columbo than a Sherlock fan. But thank you for sharing to us and linking it to your professional work.
Yeah,
I want to hear from you, Dr. Daramus, is that clearly you've been doing a lot of things within clinical psychology. You're an author, you're a practitioner, and you're also an academic. But what's the most important thing you want the people to know about your work? What's the big message from Dr. Aimee Daramus?
This is going to sound really oversimplified, but you matter and you should matter. And I feel like that's the biggest message I'm trying to give people in therapy, because they've got all these ideas about why they aren't important, why they aren't good enough. They're getting manipulated by people. They're getting stuck in bad relationships or toxic jobs. And if there's one theme that holds all of that together, is having a hard time believing that you matter, that you should have control over your life, or that you should be treated well, and that you absolutely can get away with setting boundaries when that's not happening, or with changing circumstances.
And Dr. Daramus, could you recommend...
The end that all of this is going to is people living lives where they matter.
That's really a very powerful message to convey to our audience, and I think what we can hear from you is really, there's a humanity side in psychology, and
Yeah.
that's what we have to bear in mind,
Oh, yeah.
whether we're a researcher or practitioner. Now, what I'd like to hear from you, Dr. Daramus, is because you have a wide range of interests. You're an expert in community mental health and also in digital mental health intervention. So could you recommend some sources or books about those research areas?
Yeah, probably one of the best books on community mental health that I know of is Nadine Burke-Harris's book, The Deepest Well. If you want a preview, she did a fantastic TED Talk. The well reference is to more of a physical illness. If you see an entire community coming down with stomach problems, with digestive problems, you can write all the prescriptions you want, you can cure all the individual infections that you want, but at the end of the day, you've got to figure out where that infection is coming from. So if that community is all getting their water from the same well, you got to do something about that well, because otherwise you'll just be writing prescriptions and trying to treat stomach problems forever, but it's the well that's dirty. It's the well that's infected. So that would be a great introduction that a lot of people would find accessible. Nadine Burke-Harris, The Deepest Well. Digital work, one of the best, especially for video games, is Lost in a Good Game. The author is Pete Etchells, and he's, I think, a psychologist or psychiatrist, but he writes about how when he was young and he lost his father at an early age, he intuitively figured out how to use video games to cope with that. And so he talks about the role of video games in therapy. For the pop culture piece, there's a publisher called Open Court Press that does a lot of really fun pop culture and psychology books. Let's see, Batman in psychology, superheroes in psychology, the Avengers in psychology, other stuff like that. So those would be a few to start with that would be accessible and really good reads.
Thank you for sharing those wonderful resources. And how do you relax? What's your distressing outlet?
Let's see, playing with my cat. My cat's my therapist. Reading, watching movies and TV, as you can guess. And then as things start to open up a little bit more here, I am really looking forward to going out with my friends more. The city's going to allow us to have some concerts this year, farmers markets. Really looking forward to that. And then I like to knit and crochet.
Brilliant. And Dr. Daramus, what's your professional dream?
Oh, there's a lot. I think the real dream, well, therapy is what informs everything. That's the core of it. So just to have an impact, to know that the world is different because I did something. But I also feel like, especially as I get older, I'm going to want to lean more and more towards the writing to leave some kind of a record of what I've learned. And especially to do these things that are kind of bringing therapy into the 21st century and bringing together, as much as I can, the knowledge of everybody in the field, from researcher to practitioner to client, to the families that are trying to support the clients. So definitely the end game is probably going to be the writing, but therapy is the core of what's informing all of it.
Brilliant. And definitely this interview is going to be part of your digital footprint. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a psychologist?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I might be writing very silly novels, may yet do some of that just for fun, if anybody will actually publish them. Let's see. It might also be something in history. Originally, I thought I might want to be an archaeologist, but then I realized that A, no hot Harrison Ford, and B, a really lot of camping, which is not really my thing. So, but the big decision in college was, it was either going to be history or psychology. So I'd probably be some kind of a historian.
And finally, Dr. Daramus, what else is in the pipeline? If people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at? And also, I just want to ask, I understand your book is already available on Amazon, so just remind us again of your book.
Understanding Bipolar Disorder, The Essential Family Guide. It is available on Kindle and in print. And the main goal of the book is to help families understand their family and friends with bipolar and have some skills for helping them and not burning themselves out in the process.
And do you have any social media platforms? Of course you do. So remind us again how we can get in touch with you.
Okay. My website is www.audeotherapy.com. That's AUDEO therapy.com. I'm on Twitter at audeotherapy and on Instagram at the same handle. And those are my main social media platforms. I'm on LinkedIn. Don't spend as much time on that, but I'm there. Then Facebook is more just my friends and family social media place.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll drop all those links that you gave me. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, perhaps for collaboration or learn more about the work that you do, they can get in touch with you directly. Well, Dr. Aimee Daramus, it's a pleasure having you here in the DRH show, but unfortunately our time is up. Thank you for sharing to us your knowledge and expertise, and I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you, and thank you for building PsychReg, because I feel like kind of our missions as far as getting psychology where people can really hear it and understand it is we're really compatible that way.
Thank you.
So I really appreciate what you're doing.